We live in a world of skyscrapers, AI, and global wealth, but beneath this glittering veneer lies a dark truth. More people are trapped in bondage today than at any other point in human history. Modern slavery generates billions annually, turning human lives into disposable commodities. This documentary exposes the raw reality of 21st century captivity. From high-tech cyber prisons in Southeast Asia to ancestral debt traps in South Asia, we uncover the devastating human cost behind the world we built. If you believe these stories need to be told, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps break the silence. Let's begin. Cambodia, the cyber prisons of the coast. Our investigative journey begins along the sun-drenched coastlines of Southeast Asia, where a terrifying, high-tech mutation of human captivity has quietly taken root over the past few years. If you travel to the coastal city of Sihanoukville or various isolated pockets along the international borders, you will see massive, heavily fortified concrete compounds ringed with razor wire, intense window bars, and blacked-out glass. To a passing traveler, these might look like ordinary closed-off casino resorts or industrial parks. In reality, they function as autonomous cyberscam fortresses operated by powerful transnational criminal syndicates that operate completely outside the boundaries of local law. The trap begins thousands of miles away, utilizing highly sophisticated psychological profiling on social media platforms. Recruiters post glittering advertisements promising back-office tech jobs or customer service roles featuring high salaries, free housing, and gym memberships, specifically targeting young, educated, and tech-savvy individuals who are desperate for upward mobility in a competitive economy. Have you ever wondered how easily a dream can turn into a living nightmare? The moment these unsuspecting applicants cross the Cambodian border, the illusion evaporates with terrifying speed. Criminal handlers immediately confiscate their passports, strip them of their personal mobile phones, and march them into crowded, heavily monitored digital sweatshops. Under the constant, suffocating threat of severe physical violence, electrocution, starvation, and solitary confinement, these modern captives are forced to work 14 to 18 hours a day. Their sole task is to perpetrate complex online financial frauds, romance scams, and illegal gambling operations targeting victims across Europe, America, and Asia. Thousands of desperate souls from Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and even further abroad have fallen into these high-tech cages, turning this ancient land into a digital ground zero for modern-day enslavement. Myanmar, the lawless border wastelands. Moving directly across the rugged mountain passes, we enter the dense, war-torn borderlands of Myanmar, where the breakdown of political stability has allowed human trafficking to expand to an even more industrial and perilous scale. If we look closely at lawless pockets like the Karen State, particularly along the winding Moe River directly opposite the Thai border, we find massive criminal enclaves like KK Park. These are not merely individual buildings, but entire self-sustaining cities of crime, constructed rapidly with billions of dollars of illicit capital and guarded by heavily armed local ethnic militias who answer to no central government. How do hundreds of victims end up in a war zone without realizing it? The syndicates utilize highly organized smuggling networks that bypass official immigration checkpoints entirely, guiding blindfolded victims through treacherous jungle routes under the false pretense of a corporate transfer or a legitimate business trip to Thailand. Once inside these sprawling militarized zones, a victim's freedom of movement is reduced to absolute zero. The perimeter is patrolled by guards carrying military-grade assault rifles, with strict orders to shoot anyone attempting to scale the walls. Inside these lawless zones, the conditions are notoriously brutal. Captives who fail to meet their daily quotas of defrauding innocent people online are subjected to horrific punishments, including forced military-style exercises to the point of collapse, severe beatings with iron pipes, and being sold from one criminal compound to another like literal livestock. Because these territories exist within a total geopolitical vacuum created by ongoing civil conflict, international law enforcement agencies are completely powerless to intervene. This leaves tens of thousands of trapped laborers entirely abandoned to the whims of ruthless syndicates, praying for a rescue that may never come. Mauritania, the lingering shadow of ancestral bondage. We now cross the ocean to the vast, windswept deserts of West Africa to witness a nation locked in a profound, heartbreaking struggle with the ghosts of its ancestral past. Mauritania holds a grim, undeniable distinction in modern history. It was the absolute last country on the face of the earth to officially pass a law abolishing slavery, doing so only in 1981, and it did not actually criminalize the practice until as recently as 2007. For many centuries, deep-seated caste and ethnic systems divided this desert society, subjecting minority groups, specifically the Haritan population, to hereditary bondage passed down automatically from mother to child. You might assume that passing a law automatically grants freedom, but can a piece of paper instantly erase 1,000 years of cultural conditioning? While international pressure has successfully forced traditional chattel slavery out of public sight, the devastating socioeconomic hangover remains vividly alive in the rural expanses of the Sahara. In these impoverished, isolated villages, generations of vulnerable families possess no land of their own, have never received an hour of formal education, and lack basic legal identity documents required to vote, work legally, or open a bank account. Consequently, many find themselves trapped in an invisible, inescapable cycle of domestic and agricultural exploitation. They continue to live on the properties of their traditional masters, herding cattle, farming crops, and performing grueling domestic labor in exchange for nothing more than scraps of food and basic shelter. Because they have known no other reality for generations, and because the state infrastructure to protect them is incredibly weak, the fight against modern slavery in Mauritania is not just a battle against criminal traffickers, but a slow, painful war against an entrenched social hierarchy that refuses to die. Libya, the human marketplace amidst chaos. From the desert expanses of Mauritania, we turn our gaze northward to the fractured coastline of Libya, a nation that has spent over a decade gripped by political volatility and civil strife. Following the collapse of its central government in 2011, this North African country rapidly transformed into the primary gateway for hundreds of thousands of migrants fleeing war, extreme poverty, and climate devastation across sub-Saharan Africa. Dreaming of reaching the safety of European shores across the Mediterranean, these desperate travelers risk everything, only to find themselves walking directly into a terrifying, lawless trap. Have you ever considered how quickly a dream of freedom can be commodified by the opportunistic? In the absence of a unified state military or effective police force, Libya has become a playground for heavily armed militias, human smuggling cartels, and brutal criminal gangs. These groups intercept migrant caravans in the vast southern deserts or raid safe houses in coastal towns like Tripoli and Misrata. Once captured, migrants are stripped of their meager savings and funneled into a network of overcrowded, unsanitary, and unofficial detention centers run by these armed factions. It is within these hidden underbellies of chaos that the most horrific manifestation of modern slavery occurs. International investigative bodies have documented actual, literal human auctions where migrants are lined up, evaluated based on their physical strength, and sold to local businessmen or militia commanders for a few $100s. Buyers force these captive men into backbreaking agricultural labor, construction, or hazardous waste disposal without a single cent of pay. Women are subjected to systematic domestic and sexual exploitation. Trapped in a country fractured by war, with no diplomatic representation and no legal recourse, these forgotten souls are treated as disposable capital, proving that when a state collapses, humanity's oldest cruelties quickly rush to fill the void. Pakistan, the endless generations of debt bondage. Leaving the Mediterranean behind, we travel east into South Asia to examine a form of economic captivity that does not rely on physical kidnapping or high-tech deception, but on the crushing weight of ancestral debt. In Pakistan, particularly throughout the agricultural heartlands of Punjab and Sindh, millions of impoverished citizens are trapped in a systemic cycle known as peshki, or debt bondage. This is an insidious mechanism where a vulnerable laborer takes a small, seemingly manageable loan from a wealthy landowner or brick kiln proprietor to cover an emergency, such as medical care, a funeral, or a wedding. What looks like a simple financial transaction is actually a lifetime trap. The employers manipulate the bookkeeping, applying exorbitant, completely unregulated interest rates and charging inflated prices for food and basic housing provided on site. As a result, no matter how many hours the laborer works, the debt never goes down. Instead, it steadily multiplies. The true tragedy of this system is its hereditary nature. Under local custom, if a worker dies or becomes too frail to work, the outstanding financial obligation does not vanish. It is legally and socially transferred to their children and then to their grandchildren. Walk into any of the thousands of smoke-belching brick kilns lining the rural highways, and you will see the human face of this economic prison. Entire families, men, women, and young children, work side by side from dawn until dusk, mixing clay, molding bricks by hand, and carrying heavy loads into scorching kilns under a relentless sun. They are paid in pennies, barely enough to buy flour and water. Physical mobility is strictly restricted. If a worker tries to flee, armed enforcers hired by the owners hunt them down, often using violence or local police corruption to force them back to work. It is an inescapable economic maze that systematically robs generations of their freedom before they are even born. India, the invisible millions in the underground economy. Our journey continues across the border into India, a rising global economic superpower that simultaneously battles one of the largest concentrations of forced labor on Earth. While India's major cities boast glitzy tech hubs and a booming middle class, the country's massive, sprawling informal sector harbors an intricate system of human exploitation, driven by deeply entrenched poverty, a rigid caste hierarchy, and a lack of rural employment, millions of internal migrants migrate across states each year. Relying on an unregulated network of unscrupulous labor brokers, these middlemen travel to remote, marginalized villages, offering small cash advances to desperate families and promising steady work in distant states. But when the laborers arrive at their destinations, whether they are stone quarries, commercial farms, textile mills, or embroidery workshops, the reality is starkly different. Their identification documents are seized, their promised wages are withheld under the pretext of paying off the initial travel advance, and they are forced to work in hazardous, sweatshop conditions for 18 hours a day. The most heartbreaking facet of this underground economy is the widespread exploitation of children. In various states, young children are systematically trafficked into the agricultural sector to harvest crops, or into hidden urban workshops to sew garments, weave carpets, and polish gemstones. Because these facilities operate deep within unregulated residential areas or isolated rural zones, they remain practically invisible to labor inspectors. The victims live where they work, sleeping on cold concrete floors surrounded by chemical fumes and heavy machinery. The sheer scale of India's population and geography creates a complex camouflage, allowing this vast army of invisible laborers to be exploited in plain sight to fuel global supply chains. Nepal, the shattered dreams of transnational exploitation. Nestled in the shadows of the majestic Himalayas, Nepal presents a heartbreaking paradox. A breathtakingly beautiful nation whose most valuable export has become its own youth. Driven by a lack of domestic opportunities, political stagnation, and crushing rural poverty, hundreds of thousands of young Nepalis leave their mountain villages every year in search of employment abroad. However, this desperate quest for a better life has turned the country into a fertile hunting ground for predatory, illegal recruitment agencies and unscrupulous labor brokers. How does the trap work for an entire generation? It starts with an illusion spun by local middlemen who visit remote villages, promising lucrative, safe jobs in hospitality, logistics, or construction across Southeast Asia and the Middle East. To secure these life-changing opportunities, impoverished families sell their meager plots of land, slaughter their livestock, or take out high-interest loans from local loan sharks just to pay the exorbitant recruitment and visa fees. But the moment these hopeful migrants board their flights, they are effectively severed from safety. Once they land in a foreign country, many of these young men and women disappear completely into an unregulated underground economy. Their passports are confiscated upon arrival, and they are funneled into dangerous, dirty, and demanding jobs that bear no resemblance to the contracts they signed back home. Families back in Nepal often lose contact for months or even years as these workers are kept in isolated labor camps. The tragic irony is that while remittance money sent back by migrant workers forms the absolute backbone of Nepal's national economy, it comes at a devastating human cost, leaving villages devoid of young people and returning broken, exploited, or even deceased citizens to their families. Qatar, the harsh sunset behind the glittering skyline. We now shift our gaze to the Persian Gulf, landing in Qatar, a hyper-wealthy oasis that transformed itself from a quiet pearl diving community into a futuristic metropolis of glass, steel, and multi-billion-dollar sports arenas. To achieve this unprecedented, lightning-fast architectural revolution, Qatar relied entirely on a massive army of foreign workers, who today make up over 80% of the country's total population. But behind the glittering facades of these megastructures lies a deeply controversial labor system that international human rights organizations have repeatedly equated to modern-day bondage. For decades, the foundation of Qatar's labor market was built upon the kafala system, a legal framework that bound a migrant worker's immigration status entirely to a single local employer, known as a sponsor. Under this system, a worker could not change jobs, rent an apartment, open a bank account, or even leave the country without their sponsor's explicit, written permission. This absolute imbalance of power created a fertile environment for extreme exploitation, allowing employers to withhold wages for months on end, house workers in squalid, overcrowded labor camps far from the glitz of Doha, and force them to work grueling shifts. Have you ever imagined working outside when the temperature reaches a blistering 50 degrees Celsius, 122 Fahrenheit? Thousands of young men from South Asia did exactly that, laboring under a relentless sun to build the infrastructure of the future, resulting in an alarming and heavily criticized number of unexplained deaths from heat stress and cardiovascular collapse. While international scrutiny eventually pressured the Qatari government to introduce historic legal reforms to dismantle aspects of the kafala system, the gap between legislation and real-world enforcement remains wide. For many workers on the ground, the struggle for basic dignity, fair pay, and freedom of movement remains an ongoing daily battle against an uncompromising corporate machine. The United Arab Emirates, the architectural wonders and anonymous lives. A short journey down the coast brings us to the United Arab Emirates, home to Dubai and Abu Dhabi, global symbols of ultimate luxury, architectural ambition, and unrestrained wealth. Here, Towering structures like the Burj Khalifa pierce the desert clouds, and artificial islands reshape the coastline. Yet, just like its neighbors, the glittering machinery of the UAE is powered by an invisible, disenfranchised majority, millions of low-wage migrant workers from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the Philippines who live completely segregated from the luxury they construct. Step away from the high-end shopping malls and tourist hotspots, and take a bus ride to the industrial outskirts like Sonapur. This is where the true engine of the UAE resides, massive. Sprawling labor camps housing hundreds of thousands of men packed into tight, basic rooms. Despite strict laws officially banning the practice, many unscrupulous subcontracting companies still routinely confiscate the passports of their workers immediately upon arrival at the airport, effectively stripping them of their right to leave or protest unfair treatment. The economic divide here is one of the most drastic on the planet. While ultra-wealthy residents and international expats enjoy a playground of unparalleled luxury, the construction workers and domestic maids who clean their villas and build their penthouses often earn just a few $100s a month. Many find themselves trapped because their wages are deductions for illegal recruitment fees they were forced to pay back home, leaving them with nothing to send back to their families. These anonymous individuals spend years of their lives sweating in the desert heat, building monuments to a wealth they will never touch, trapped within a system that views them not as human beings but as temporary, replaceable units of labor. Saudi Arabia, the domestic isolation and the silent walls. We journey further into the heart of the Arabian Peninsula to examine Saudi Arabia, a kingdom undergoing a massive social and architectural transformation, yet one that still wrestles with deep-rooted systemic exploitation. Within this sprawling nation, millions of foreign nationals make up the backbone of the service, construction, and domestic sectors. But while construction workers face hardships in public view, it is the invisible army of female domestic workers, maids, nannies, and caretakers, who face the most acute dangers of modern captivity, hidden away behind the thick, silent walls of private family estates. How do you seek help when your workplace is a private home and you are forbidden from stepping past the front door? For decades, the kafala sponsorship system gave Saudi employers absolute unchecked legal authority over these women's lives. Even with recent labor reforms aimed at increasing flexibility, domestic workers remain highly vulnerable, frequently excluded from standard labor law protections that govern regular hours, overtime, and weekend rest. Once a woman arrives from a village in Africa or Southeast Asia, her employer often seizes her passport and mobile phone immediately. Isolated from her family, unable to speak the local language, and completely cut off from society, she is at the absolute mercy of her sponsors. Documented cases reveal a harrowing spectrum of abuse. Women forced to work 20 hours a day without a single day off, deprived of adequate food, subjected to severe physical or psychological violence, and denied their salaries for months or even years. Because the home is considered a sacred, private space in local culture, labor inspectors cannot easily cross the threshold, leaving these women trapped in an intimate, terrifying form of modern servitude where their cries for freedom are muffled by the very walls they are forced to clean. Thailand, the ghost ships of the seafood empire. We now return to Southeast Asia to investigate a maritime crisis that shocked the global conscience and exposed the dark underbelly of international global supply chains. Thailand is a global superpower in the seafood export industry, supplying billions of dollars worth of shrimp, fish, and canned tuna to supermarkets across Europe and North America. However, beneath the waves of the Andaman Sea and the Gulf of Thailand lies a brutal system of forced labor that turned commercial fishing vessels into literal floating prisons. The tragedy unfolds along the chaotic ports of Thailand, where a severe labor shortage drove fishing captains to rely on aggressive human trafficking syndicates. These networks target undocumented migrants fleeing political instability or extreme poverty in neighboring Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. Duped by false promises of factory work, these men are drugged, kidnapped, or coerced onto long-haul wooden trawlers. Once the ships pull away from the harbor, the trap snaps shut, and the open ocean becomes an inescapable cage. Life on these ghost ships is a relentless cycle of exhaustion and terror. Laborers are forced to haul heavy, freezing nets for 20 hours a day, sleeping in short, erratic shifts on filthy decks and drinking foul, contaminated water. If a worker becomes ill, slows down, or attempts to mutiny, the punishments are barbaric. International human rights investigations have documented instances of rebellious workers being beaten with stingray, tails locked in iron cages, or simply executed and thrown overboard. Because these vessels often remain at sea for months or even years at a time, refueling and transferring their catches to massive transshipment cargo ships without ever returning to port, the captives have absolutely no way to escape or contact the outside world, serving as a chilling reminder of how modern slavery can thrive in the lawless expanses of the global commons. Indonesia, the hidden cages of the archipelago. Our exploration takes us south into the sprawling maritime maze of Indonesia, an archipelago of over 17,000 islands where geography itself becomes a powerful tool of human confinement. In the remote, isolated waters of the Arafura Sea, far from the watchful eyes of maritime authorities or international inspectors, lies a dark network of illegal fishing operations and hazardous mining enclaves that rely entirely on the systematic degradation of human life. Consider the sheer logistical impossibility of escaping an island when you do not even know its name or geographic coordinates. A chilling example of this occurred on the remote Indonesian island of Benjina, where a massive international investigation uncovered hundreds of foreign fishermen held in actual, physical wooden cages when they weren't being forced to work on fishing boats. Trafficked from across Southeast Asia, these men were kept in slave-like conditions, treated with unimaginable cruelty, and forced to labor under the constant threat of violence to harvest premium seafood destined for global dinner tables. While large-scale, high-profile rescues by Indonesian authorities dismantled the horrors of Benjina, the practice of utilizing remote geography for human exploitation continues to shift to new uncharted islands and hidden mainland mining camps. Deep within the dense, inaccessible jungles of various islands, unregulated nickel, gold, and tin mining operations exploit thousands of vulnerable local and migrant laborers. These workers live in squalid, makeshift camps, lack basic safety gear, and handle highly toxic chemicals with their bare hands. Cut off from all communication networks, lacking any means of transportation, and hundreds of miles away from any government office, these individuals are functionally marooned, trapped in an inescapable economic and physical prison dictated by the harsh demands of global industrial consumption. North Korea, the state-sponsored export of captive labor. Our global investigation now takes us to one of the most secretive and tightly controlled nations on Earth, North Korea. Unlike other regions where modern slavery is driven by underground criminal syndicates or private corporate greed, here it is operated directly by the state apparatus itself. Facing severe international economic sanctions and a desperate shortage of foreign currency, the Pyongyang regime has transformed its own citizens into a highly lucrative export commodity, deploying tens of thousands of workers across international borders to fuel its state coffers. How does a government legally lease its own people into bondage? Under the guise of overseas educational programs or bilateral labor agreements, these citizens are sent to work in diverse industries abroad, ranging from logging camps in the frozen wilderness of Siberia and construction sites in the Middle East to textile factories and seafood processing plants across Asia. These workers are carefully selected based on their political loyalty, and the state often ensures compliance by forcing them to leave their spouses and children behind in North Korea as literal state hostages to prevent defection. Once abroad, the illusion of an economic opportunity completely shatters. These state-sponsored laborers work under the constant, suffocating surveillance of North Korean security agents who monitor their every move, conversation, and thought. They work grueling 16-hour shifts, often with no days off, and face severe malnutrition and hazardous safety conditions. But the most staggering aspect of this system is financial. Up to 90% of their hard-earned salaries is confiscated directly by government handlers and funneled back to Pyongyang to fund the regime's luxury goods and military programs. It is an industrial-scale system of human exploitation where an entire population is legally trafficked by their own government, working as anonymous cogs in a global machine to sustain an isolated regime. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the blood in our technology. We now cross the ocean to the mineral-rich heart of Central Africa, arriving in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC possesses an incredible multi-trillion-dollar curse. It sits upon the world's largest reserves of cobalt, coltan, and copper, the essential raw minerals required to power our modern digital lives. Every smartphone, laptop, electric vehicle battery, and advanced AI microchip relies entirely on these precious elements. Yet, behind the clean, green transition celebrated by tech conglomerates lies a brutal, blood-stained reality of modern-day mining servitude. Walk into any of the massive, artisanal mining zones in provinces like Lualaba or Haut-Katanga, and you will step into a living hell. In these sprawling, unregulated craters, hundreds of thousands of Congolese citizens, including children as young as 6 years old, labor in conditions that closely mirror 19th century chattel, slavery. Lacking heavy machinery, safety gear, or even basic helmets, these artisanal miners are forced by local warlords, corrupt officials, and mining brokers to dig deep into unstable underground shafts using nothing but their bare hands and primitive shovels. The human cost of our digital convenience is devastating. Toxic cobalt dust causes chronic, fatal lung diseases and severe skin ulcers, while primitive tunnels collapse frequently, burying workers alive under tons of rock. These laborers work from dawn to dusk under a scorching sun or in oxygen-deprived tunnels for less than $2 a day. They are trapped in an inescapable economic vice. They cannot leave because there are no other survival mechanisms in the region, and they are surrounded by armed militias who control the trade. Our sleek, high-tech world is fundamentally anchored to this primitive, violent exploitation, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that our digital future is being built on the broken backs of modern slaves. Haiti, the tragic vortex of predatory exploitation. Our final destination brings us back to the Western Hemisphere, to the Caribbean nation of Haiti, where a devastating convergence of historical debt, political assassinations, and catastrophic natural disasters has fueled one of the most severe humanitarian crises of our century. Following the total collapse of state institutions and the subsequent rise of heavily armed, ruthless gangs that now control vast swathes of the capital city, Port-au-Prince, the vulnerable civilian population has been left entirely unprotected, creating a fertile breeding ground for a deeply troubling domestic slave trade. In Haiti, this predatory cycle is known by a specific chilling Creole term, the Restavek system. Driven by absolute, crushing poverty and the constant threat of gang violence, hundreds of thousands of desperate rural parents face an unimaginable choice. Unable to feed, clothe, or educate their children, they give them away to wealthier urban families, under the false promise that the child will receive proper care, shelter, and a formal education in exchange for performing minor household chores. But the moment these children cross the threshold of their new homes, the promise evaporates into absolute servitude. These children become domestic captives, forced to cook, clean, carry heavy buckets of water over long distances, and work endless hours without a single cent of compensation. Because they are viewed as socially inferior and lack any protective legal framework, Restavek children are frequently subjected to severe psychological degradation, physical beatings, and systemic abuse. They are isolated from their biological families and hidden deep within private residences, transforming a desperate survival strategy into a multi-generational cycle of modern captivity that continues to rob Haiti's most vulnerable youth of their childhood and their future. The stories we have uncovered across these 15 regions prove that modern slavery is not a relic of the past, but an active, bleeding wound of our globalized economy. It thrives in the gaps left by war, state collapse, poverty, and our insatiable demand for cheap goods and high-tech convenience. But acknowledging this dark reality is the first step toward dismantling it. As consumers, citizens, and human beings, we hold the power to demand transparency from global corporations, support anti-trafficking organizations, and amplify the voices of those who have been systematically silenced. The chains of the 21st century may be invisible, but they are not unbreakable. Thank you for watching, and together, let us refuse to look away.